There we go. Okay. Non-profits are more than ever in an attempt to be effective in what they do, underfinanced and stretched to their limits. They often suffer the consequences of very limited budgets, poorly developed finance, management and fundraising systems, and inadequate training in essential skills. The fact is that the actions of SA NPOs are needed now more than ever, and it's crucial that organizations across all issues and areas attentively consider what role they can play in navigating the country through these uncertain political and often volatile times. Some NPOs whose missions and visions are under threat seem well equipped to deal with different issues pertaining to the macro environment in which these organizations find themselves, but the same cannot be said for all. Many NPOs aren't in the same position of power and influence, and it's often difficult to determine how and what to communicate to different constituencies, to know what to tweet next, to know what statements to issue to the media, to understand what action steps should be utilized. The truth is that a reactive approach can spiral out of control fast, lead NPOs to inflate their connections to a particular issue, and is just unsustainable for most communication teams running with limited staff resources and infrastructures. Staying silent on current events that impact communities may also not be an option. NPOs might then be perceived as out of touch and miss opportunities to make a powerful statement about what they stand for. So my research question is, how could NPOs harness the power of communication to deliver results and have impact in their communities while at the same time embracing their constituencies as vibrant and powerful entities? My research approach was qualitative. I'm not going to spend too much time on the method itself. Let's move on to the context. Non-profit organizations in SA are defined and described according to their function and source of funding. The development of NPOs in South Africa is closely related to the historical development of the country. The term NPO defines all civic organizations such as non-government organizations, community-based and also faith-based organizations. These NPOs are characterized by being legal entities, having a not-for-profit focus, acting independently as self-governing entities with voluntary membership. According to the Department of Social Development, there are approximately 125,000 NPOs registered, ranging from well-known and established organizations such as Child Welfare South Africa, with offices throughout the country, to medium-sized organizations and even local, small community-based organizations such as the Befenye Trust in Potchefstroom, which offers various care facilities to local residents in the Ikageng area. The NPO landscape in South Africa has seen dramatic changes since these early days of democracy, with many more individuals having access to financial support in the form of social grants. However, at the same time, many NPOs are struggling to survive due to a lack of funding, poor infrastructure, a lack of human resources, and leadership capacity. The implementation of policies seem to lack a developmental focus, resulting in a discrepancy between what is proclaimed in government policy in comparison to what is actually being provided. The involvement of community practitioners as relationship builders and cultural intermediaries should assist organizations and government structures in achieving objectives and influencing change in society. Let me move on to the different theoretical aspects that form the basis of my research. First of all, the aspect of branding and brand management. Now, these concepts are well-known subfields in the marketing management, but although being addressed in the NPO sector in South Africa, these are still emerging areas of practice. SA NPOs are faced with very distinct brand and brand management challenges, which are overlaid with the reality of 11 official languages, a rich cultural diversity, and the need to decolonize policies and practices. These challenges include having to relate to a wide variety of stakeholder groups and managing their brands, as well as the need to negotiate power, a partner, sponsor, and also donor relationships. In the midst of competition with for-profit companies, the public sector and other NPOs often manage their brands with a relationship building aim. Brands are associated with identifying the organization, differentiating it from similar institutions, and creating a competitive advantage for the organization. Brands are also used to create a sense of trust and credibility in the organization, which also forms the basis of building relationships with many stakeholders. Building trust, credibility, and other aspects of brands, such as brand personality and symbolic traits, are crucial to NPOs, but can assume a much greater importance in a country like South Africa, striving to decolonize and establish social justice. Take the example of the South African National Blood Service. Their brand signifies the importance of giving life. Through blood donation, citizens in South Africa have the opportunity to give someone in need of blood transfusion more than mere blood, rather providing that person with the possibility to continue living. giving them the most precious gift of all, life. In this instance, the SA NBS brand portrays a brand personality that resonates with the essence of every person, and that is life itself. In the South African context, NPO brand development is characterized by limited budgets, presenting a much bigger challenge than in the case of for-profit organizations. Now, let me specifically focus on some of the brand aspects that I find interesting and most relevant to the study, and that the first is brand personality. It's received growing attention in the SA NPO context, with a shift from tangible characteristics such as name, logo, signage, and slogans to more human characteristics associated with brands, thus referring to personality. In the case of humans, NPO brands, in the same, are more and more being related with characteristics such as trustworthiness, integrity, credibility, caring, and longevity, to name but a few. Personality aspects of NPO brands are especially important when one takes into consideration that NPOs need to establish a credible and trustworthy relationship with their many stakeholders so that they can obtain what is needed for them to continue the work they've committed themselves to. Stakeholders refer to the brand personality as one of the aspects necessary to determine whether they can relate to the particular NPO and continue their support, be it in the form of monetary support or time. Example of effective brand personalities in SA NPOs can be found in many NPOs focusing on education and employment, where credible brand personalities are vital. This is due to the historical legacy of the struggle against apartheid, which meant and means that many South African adults had to be supported through adult basic education and training, or ABIT programs. The next element I'd like to focus on is brand history. Having a history that's enriched by values, missions, and strategic goals have enabled some organizations to stay afloat irrespective of turbulent times. Such NPOs boast with histories filled with strong relationships between themselves and their many stakeholders, built over time, and having a heritage which became much more than intricate organizational and managerial strategies, but rather a heritage built on trust and delivering on social promises made during engagement with stakeholders. Some of these examples would include South African Depression and Anxiety Group, or SADAG, the South African National Blood Service, Cancer, and Child Care South Africa. The SA National Council for the Blind has a history of active opposition to apartheid pre-1994, playing a leading role in encouraging activism by organizations of disabled people. This history is remembered and forms part of the SANCB brand in a decolonizing SA. The third element is stakeholder expectations encapsulated in the marketing concept of positioning, and that is the difference audiences think, different audiences think of the NPO. In the NPO context, these individuals or group include beneficiaries, donors, government, etc. This complicates the NPO brand management in any country, but assumes an even greater challenge in South Africa, the Rainbow Nation, with its pre-1994 history, because organizations are now faced with having to manage often various conflicting perceptions of the brand. This challenge makes stakeholder engagement multifaceted and a complex managerial function which communication practitioners need to deal with. The next aspect is the fact that NPOs are working with services and not products. NPOs need strong brands if they are to survive and fulfill their missions. The struggles NPOs face are intense, and only those with competitive advantages seem to survive. Brands provide NPOs with the opportunity to market the organization as a brand. Every aspect of the organization then becomes part of that brand, which enables the stakeholders to hold a strong, or maybe even a song in the heart, who knows, a favorable and unique association to the organization. I'd like to move on to the second theoretical aspect, and that is relationship management. We're all familiar with that, so I'm just going to highlight a few important aspects. Building relationships to obtain and strengthen the support of stakeholders, as is the case of NPOs, support for their causes, are some of the key functions of communication practitioners and have been the center of many organization public relations studies. After the democratic elections of 1994, the government needed to create policy aimed at partnering with civil society, with access to services regarded as the constitutional right available to all South Africans. The South African economic, social, and political challenges have prompted NPOs to focus more on the relationship with numerous stakeholders and also corporate partners, while building their brands to become a trusted entity between the different partners. Relationship management represents a renewed focus on building, nurturing, and maintaining relationships. It provides a platform for dialogue and discussion of issues, which is extremely important for NPOs, where stakeholders can hold different values and often come to different conclusions concerning organizations. As one of the literature sources specifically says, effectively managing organizational public relations around common interests and shared goals over time results in mutual understanding and benefit for interacting organizations and publics. Relationship management within the NPO context indicates how the organization and their stakeholders should interact with one another. This puts a priority on NPOs identifying their stakeholders as well as the nature of the current relationship between the organisation and the stakeholders. The third component is corporate social responsibility. The complex and pluralistic South African environment, with its history of apartheid, segregation and racial tension, requires an understanding of corporate's motivation for supporting a specific cause, the strategic motivation for the project, as well as the manner of reporting. According to literature, CSR is practiced along a spectrum ranging from simply gaining publicity for a corporate through a focus on social change which benefits society. Now, what are the implications for good practice? Communication practitioners and NPOs should understand and actively research social issues to ensure an inclusive and strategic approach to CSR in local African communities. As change agents and cultural intermediaries, they have the opportunity to educate and involve themselves in developmental issues, promote sustainable involvement of business in society, and ensure integrated triple bottom line reporting. The last aspect, theoretically, which I'd like to focus on, is social innovation. In 2012, the South African Department of Social Development restructured the registration of NPOs. Following this deregistration crisis, the need for a different, innovative approach to NPO practice in South Africa began and became an issue of social debate. On the one hand, there was a call for partnerships to be formed, while on the flip side of the coin, argued for CSR and community involvement to address issues associated with a developmental state such as SA. This raises the question, what should social networks and communication look like? How can they be measured? And what are the actual benefits to communication as a whole? Other policy and governance matters affecting NPOs in SA also include equity in the workplace and skills development of staff. According to literature, skills needed from change agents such as public relations or communication practitioners in these contexts include entrepreneurial relationship building and brokering, knowledge and resource brokering, and network recharging to ensure network development for human benefit and resilience. Social network theory, and specifically the development of human networks to the benefit of NPOs, should be based on the values described in organizational missions. Social networks are described as specific social organizations with both historical and vertical lines of contact. Communication practitioners, as cultural intermediaries and relationship builders, may have a key function in using their agency to promote social innovation to address complex problems experienced by NPOs in South Africa. This is an area for future research and knowledge development for communication scholars and NPO practitioners. South Africa's non-profit organizations should measure their progress in fulfilling their mission, their success in mobilizing their resources and their staff's effectiveness on the job. Non-profits able to strengthen themselves in alignment with their goals will be organizations faced with several opportunities, even in the midst of uncertainty and power struggles. During this presentation, some of the challenges and opportunities available to communication practitioners in the NPO sector of South Africa were addressed. The challenges include the multilingual, pluralistic, and richly diverse context in which NPOs provide services, and the issues of limited resources, lack of infrastructure, and adequate brand leadership. However, these challenges create opportunities for more effective relationship building, more social networks, and the development of social capital through strategic communication, enabling NPOs to harness their communication power and influence. Keep calm, it's the end of my presentation. The eagle has landed.
Okay, thanks everyone. I'm Vanessa Malila. I work for an organization based here at Rhodes University called the Public Service Accountability Monitor. I have a couple of disclaimers before I start my presentation. The first is that for many, many years I was a media studies academic and I was very comfortable in that space. And I have very recently shifted to a very different space. And so this presentation is, I suppose, about me also grappling with a change, a shift in direction, and conceptual kind of grapplings that I'm going through at the moment. So any advice that you have would be great. The second disclaimer is that the presentation is based on research that is really in its infancy. So it's really just looking at a pilot study that I've done thus far. So again, if you have any criticisms and suggestions, I'd be most grateful. Okay, so the presentation is looking at the role of the media in social accountability advocacy. The organization that I work for, PSAM, is really at the forefront of kind of social accountability monitoring in South Africa and in the region. We do capacity building around social accountability, we do research around social accountability, and we do actual social accountability monitoring in the Eastern Cape. And so what I'm trying to kind of grapple with is what is the role of the media in holding duty bearers to account, and how do we understand that specifically in the Eastern Cape context at the moment. So in terms of the Eastern Cape, we all know the Eastern Cape is one of the poorest provinces in the country. It is you know, always kind of the naughty child. It's at the very bottom of all of the kind of indices in terms of poverty indexes, access to water. It's largely rural. It has about 40% youth unemployment. And in terms of education, we see that you know, there are large inadequacies that result from the broader kind of socio-economic inadequacies in the Eastern Cape. In terms of the Eastern Cape education context, we all know that the Minister of Basic Education, Angie Motshekga, in November 2013 set out some legally binding norms and standards for school infrastructure. And basically what that means is that there were certain targets that needed to be met for schools to be at a basic standard of acceptability in terms of infrastructure. So this meant, for example, that by November 2016, all schools that have any that are built of any inappropriate materials, such as asbestos or mud, would be replaced. That was one of the targets which was not met. Some of the other targets include things, for example, like sanitation in schools, water in schools, science laboratories, having libraries, and so there are a number of targets. Unfortunately, a lot of these were not met, and part of the problem in the Eastern Cape is not through a lack of resources. So one of our budget analyses revealed that the Eastern Cape Department of Education underspent its 2015-2016 budget allocation of 1.2 billion by an estimated 574 million. Okay, so we're arguing that it's not a lack of resources that are inhibiting infrastructure development and adequate service delivery in schools. The underspending is representative of the dire lack of capacity on the side of both the ECDOE and the implementing agents, which work with the ECDOE to deliver school infrastructure. Underspending in part resulted in the ECDOE building only 3 of 24 schools that it had planned to build. Okay? So part of what we do is to try and hold departments like this accountable in terms of understanding, you know, why was there an underspend? Where are the deficiencies in terms of service delivery? In terms of the Eastern Cape, we see that 53% of all schools with no water supply are based in the Eastern Cape, and 73% of those have no ablution facilities. The Eastern Cape Plan for implementing norms and standards for school infrastructure has a paragraph heading called Backlog Analysis. There's nothing written in that paragraph, okay? So we're pointing to further deficiencies in terms of what's happening in the Eastern Cape, in that it's not necessary, it's not about resources, it's not always about capacity, it's also about the fact that the department is not planning adequately, they're not doing needs analyses properly, they are not allocating budgets properly. There is a real major problem going on in the Eastern Cape. Just to move away from the statistics, I want to read you an excerpt from an interview that was done with a teacher in the Eastern Cape. This comes from a report that was co-published by PSAM and Equal Education, which is a kind of education advocacy civil society organization in South Africa. And she says, there are 437 learners at our school. We are 11 teachers, including the principal, but that's not enough, and this means that our classes are overcrowded. I teach grade 4, 5, and 6. Presently, there are 50 learners in my grade 4 class and 45 in my grade 5. The physical environment within which I work is not easy. Our school does not have internet, a fax machine, or landlines. There are 2 ways to contact the Education District Office in Mthatha. We can use our personal cell phones, or we can travel 65 kilometers to Mthatha. Some of our learners have to walk quite far to get to school. Some walk a total of 5 hours to and back from school. On rainy days, learners who have to walk far often do not come to school. When the Mbashi River is full, then there are learners who are forced to stay at home or risk their lives crossing the river. The 7 mud structures classrooms were built by the community in the late 1990s. I teach grade 4 and 5s in the mud structures and my grade 6 in the other structures. It's horrible teaching in the mud classrooms. So that gives you a real sense of what it actually means to be a teacher, to be a learner in the context of the Eastern Cape education system. Beyond the statistics, you know, children are risking their lives to actually get an education. And teachers are facing, you know, insurmountable problems in terms of providing quality education under the circumstances. This just gives you some more statistics about the kind of national context. 171 schools have no water supply, 569 schools have no electricity, etc., etc. And so the question for us is really what can be done? We have major deficiencies in terms of the system of providing education, looking here in the Eastern Cape. And so our organization uses social accountability as a tool for trying to improve service delivery across a number of sectors, including education. So what is social accountability? It's the broad range of actions and mechanisms beyond voting that citizens can use to hold the state to account. So every 4 or 5 years we go to the polls and we say, yes, you've done well as a party or as a president or as a councillor. You know, we're going to keep you in place. Or we hold you account and we say, no, actually you haven't done very well, we want to try somebody else. But what can citizens do when they're not enacting their voting rights? Accountability, social accountability is accountability that relies on civic engagement, namely a situation whereby citizens and civil society organizations participate directly or indirectly in exacting accountability. And so the question for me is, how does the media play a role in that bridge between the citizens and the duty bearers, and that kind of being held to account by citizens and being accountable to citizens of those in power? What role does the media play in that bridge? Social accountability emphasizes political and socio-economic rights of citizens, and it's really about a relationship between the demand side, so in terms of citizens and civil society, and the supplier side, those who are implementing, providing services. Social accountability relies on both demand and supply side actors interacting with each other. It's about citizens, civil society, media, communities monitoring the behavior and decisions of duty bearers and extracting accountability on various issues. The core premise of our approach at PSAM is that social accountability is not only essential in the realization of human rights, but is in fact a right of every citizen. We have the right as citizens to hold duty bearers to account. It is something that we should be doing. And as such, you know, as a key part of society, how does the media help citizens to enact that right? So it's the right of citizens to demand explanations and justifications for the way that public resources are spent, and then demand corrective action where necessary. And so the question, as I said, comes back. What is the role of journalists in this? And so I've for many years looked at different types of roles of journalists, and on the one hand, the media is criticized very strongly by the ANC in terms of being too critical for the ANC. One of the biggest arguments made consistently in ANC documents that we analyzed was that the media were adopting an anti-transformation, anti-developmental, and anti-ANC stance. And we hear that all the time, that the media, in terms of their function as watchdogs of society, have been overly critical of the ANC. On the other hand, research that we did also shows that journalists in South Africa considered the media's role as a watchdog, but as important. So they consider that watchdog role as important, but that journalists also believe it's important to support national development and government policy. So on the one hand, you have, ideas of the media as being overly critical, anti-transformation, and on the other hand, you have journalists, and we interviewed about 2,500 journalists in South Africa who said, in fact, we do regard ourselves as watchdogs of society, but we also understand the importance of national development and playing a role in national development. So how do we understand, those kinds of tensions? And really, what role could journalists be playing in holding poor and effective education service delivery to account? Because I think part of what I'm trying to argue is that there is a lot of criticism about education, about other services that are failing in South Africa. There's a lot of criticism. There's a lot written about it in the media. But does that mean that they're actually holding duty bearers to account in a way that enables citizens, that actually improves services? Okay, so in terms of what I did, or what I've done thus far, as I said, this is based on a pilot study, so it's a very small kind of glimpse. And I concede it's a very shallow glimpse, because it was a quantitative content analysis of a sample of newspaper reports which were published, which looked at education in the Eastern Cape, specifically between 2005 and 2016. And so in terms of what that means is that I was looking at, who were the actors in the stories, what kind of tone was used, who were the sources in the stories, what were the stories about, and kind of counting that up. So just really to give me a very kind of, not a very in-depth glimpse into what's actually going on, but just a kind of, I think, an overview of what's happening. This is just some examples of some of the publications. Sorry, how long do I have? 2 minutes, okay. So in terms of reporting, what we found is that in terms of who were the actors, it was usually either a government official from the province, or a national government official, or the office itself. Learners obviously featured very high, and then the teachers' union as well features in there. Okay, and this was across all the stories, across the different types of actors. How were they reported? Most of the stories, regardless of who the actor was, most of them were reported in a very neutral way, so not really any kind of oppositional or kind of antagonistic writing towards the actors. I looked very kind of briefly at what I called the type of journalism, in terms of, was it calling for change, was it pointing fingers, did it lack analysis, was it very in-depth, or did it only provide information? And that was really the bulk of the type of journalism. It was really just about saying, this is what happened, this is what the government official said about it, this is what usually an education expert or a CSO said about it. And now you as the reader must go and decide what you want to do with that information. That was really the type of reporting that was coming out. And so the question is, there's a lot of writing about the education crisis, especially in the Eastern Cape. It is written about as a crisis, but what role is the media playing in actually holding duty bearers to account and trying to change the system of service delivery in education? So I think some of the problems is that there seems to be a persistent need for this balanced reporting. Here is the event, or here is an instance of corruption, for example, and we'll tell you what the official response is, and we'll tell you what somebody else, and we'll balance out the story, and you as a reader must go and decide what to do with it. I'm not sure that that's particularly helpful. There seems to be a lack of understanding of the public resource management system by journalists. So very often they'll report about a budget, for example, but they don't understand that it falls within a broader system of, how is the budget allocated? Was there a needs analysis done for the budget? How were activities appointed and expenditure managed, that kind of thing. There's a failure to recognize systemic issues rather than events at crisis level. So really it's about waiting for there to be a massive crisis in terms of an event or a big issue that comes up, and not really understanding it as a broader social problem and part of a system of failure. And then I think that empowerment of citizens is lacking. If one of the roles of the media is to help bridge that, the divide between citizens and the state or power holders, they don't seem to be doing that in a particularly effective way. So information is not really always relevant to people, ordinary people. It's not useful, it's not accessible, and it's not contextual. Okay, just to finish off. It seems that the media is really filling the information gap rather than the power gap. And Wallach says that the power gap is the target of media advocacy, is the power gap. It attempts to motivate broad social and political involvement rather than changes in health behavior. So there's a lot written about health in terms of social accountability. And so I think this is a great idea that, in terms of accountability, the media should be helping society to get more involved rather than to try and just change the behavior of one person. It's about their involvement in accountability. And then Dennis McQuail says, it's hard to escape from the fact that the media generally do follow the tastes and interests of their audiences and also the needs of their sources and clients, including politicians and governments who are supposed to look after the public interest. We cannot be sure that even with more opportunities, the public would welcome better media or embrace the more desirable forms of accountability, which requires some continuing effort on their part. So I suppose the other side of the question is even if the media were giving their audiences, their readers, really excellent coverage and really kind of, the kind of information they can use to hold governments to account, the question is, would citizens actually do that? Would they actually get involved? And I think that's a whole other question. So that's it. Thank you. Oh, okay, sorry.
Okay, the last speaker we have to call on Miss Kathy. She will be talking to us on some findings from participatory action, research into the understanding and communication of home literacy practices by working class parents. Sounds interesting.
This is a terrifying background, I have to say.
Which one is it?
Okay. Just that one, but then I will need to go into those at times. thank you to who opened my eyes to the fact that I'm militant and subversive in what I do. Years as a kind of perfect storm, where the Rhodes Community Engagement Office has been engaging with Rhodes workers, grades 1 to 5, as part of the Vice Chancellor's Education Initiative, to support the parents of school-going children, to help the parents support their children. So linking into that, which is called the Insaw Me Project, and the coordinator, Tabani, is here with us this morning. It was specifically supporting the development of children's literacy through rekindling home literacy and language practices as opposed to just leaving it to schools to educate children and see to their literacy development. And then myself as a literacy activist and the coordinator of literacy programs, as I said, at a local NGO, looking to do a master's study that would combine that interest in literacy work at grassroots level with my interest in journalism and media. And then, of course, the access that I had to Rhodes journalism staff and students for the production of media led me to 26 grade 1 to 5 workers in the first year, and it's since grown to around 130 participants in subsequent year that it was done. It was started in 2015. It consisted of the following value proposition: the provision of colourful, appropriate books, pre-selected and packaged specifically according to age and language. So starting the younger children with more isiXhosa books and then moving to more English books as they got older. In very beautiful shwe bags that the parents could borrow and take home and exchange every fortnight, and basically have reading material to engage with their children every day. Plus some termly workshops where there was input and discussion around children's literacy development. Okay, so my aim as a development practitioner and as someone who's interested also in development support communication is to create agency, to support people's ability to communicate around these issues of children's literacy development, and we'll see in a minute what that looks like, but then to gradually withdraw because more and more agency has been created through supporting people in their own communication, looking at their communicative ecologies, looking at what they're able to do within their particular communicative contexts. And it's a little bit about Nancy Fraser, who sort of reimagines Habermas's work on the public sphere. She talks about subaltern publics, and I like her idea of the notion of agitational training grounds, which is basically working in safe spaces to become change agents in order to move out into the public sphere in due course, once that confidence has been built up. And someone else talks about making the targets of change the agents of change. So while those particular parents are being worked with to change their behavior and their home literacy practices, they were also being worked with to become agents of change in other people's lives and changing other people's behavior. And that relies on an asset-based approach, assuming that the people that are going to be communicating and participating and communicating have the assets to engage in that communication. And just talk a little bit about EduRoam access. EduRoam, as you know, is what's available to people in academic spaces and on campuses. And we've agitated quite hard to get all the workers on the Rhodes campus EduRoam access, because in order for them to access a lot of the networks and the information and the communication that's going on, they need to have that access to EduRoam. And it wasn't straightforward, and it isn't straightforward, and we're still busy with that process. But that was very much part of it as well. Okay, so it's essentially looking at three elements coming together. social networks and local knowledge of how people communicate, where they communicate, and whom they communicate with, plus their personal experiences and their stories that they had to tell, plus the media and technology that we could come up with and that could be supported in terms of what was produced. Producing what we call effective communication for development. Some theory that I've been drawing on is the notion of development support communication, Malcott and Steves. I don't know if any of you are familiar with their work, as opposed to development communication, which is within the modernization paradigm is top-down messages, whereas development support communication is developing people at grassroots level and supporting people to communicate at grassroots level from the grassroots up, sort of horizontally and then vertically. And it also relates a little bit to what the previous speaker was talking about, Putnam, bonding and bridging capital. So it's turning the whole messaging, development communication, messaging, a way of doing things and way of communicating on its head, and rather supporting people at grassroots level to communicate. And very strongly also drawing on Foth and Hearn, who've written a lot about communicative ecology, and then more latterly on Lenny Tachi's work on communication for development. And I've just got a little bit of an overview of the concept of communicative ecology, very, very briefly, to say, and this is Hearn et al. In 2009, in Lenny Tachi's Evaluating Communication for Development. It is important to look at everything that could count as a medium of communication. That is not just press, broadcasting, or telecoms, but also roads, buses and trains, or in our case probably taxis, visits to neighbors, gossip, and public and private places where people meet to communicate. It's also important to look at how people combine different media. So communicative ecology places media technologies in the context of all the ways of communicating that are significant locally, including face-to-face interaction. So really it's looking at how do people communicate in a particular context, where and with whom. It's not going to be the same for everybody. My communicative ecology is different to yours, it's different to someone in a different context. So it's really utilizing that localized knowledge of communication networks that we were building on. And a little bit of salmon around social marketing. How do we sell, inverted commas, ideas in the same way, do we go about it in the same way as you would sell washing powder? Or how does one go about spreading and communicating ideas and behavioral changes? Okay, so the steps I took were focus group discussions, media ecology questionnaires with the group, the creation of a Facebook page and a WhatsApp group so that bonding capital could build amongst them, and then kind of electing what we called a vanguard of the vanguard. So the initial group of 26 were the sort of vanguard group for this project for Insomi, which by the way means traditional story. And then out of that, 7 were proposed, elected, who were kind of going to be the participants with me in the social learning process. And then mapping their particular communicative ecologies, which, for instance, was very much communicating in third places like churches, Stokvels, at sports clubs, in women's groups, etc. Reading Isoles Way, listening to Radio Grahamstown, and using WhatsApp. That's kind of an example of what and reading the local newspaper, Grokos Mail, would be their kind of communicative ecology, largely that they came up with. And then identifying on the basis of that the relevant means of communication based on those communicative ecologies that we mapped. And we came up with materials for third places. And here I'd like to just show you, how do I go out of this now? I just wanted to show some of the posters that we made with the participants that they then put up in their areas. Did I go to the posters? Posters? Yeah. Can you make it, is there any way of making it smaller so we can see the whole poster in one go, or do we have to scroll down? So each of the posters had a visual of the participant with their children in whatever setting, either at home or in a mostly they were at home, or sometimes they were in the library or in the play park, with a personalized quote from them and their name on the poster, and then the Facebook page that had been created. So we had for each of the 7 participants, we had posters like this made. A senior photography student did the images for us, and a design student did the design of the posters for us, and then these were put up by the participants in all the areas where they live, and the churches where they go, and the spaces that they frequent, as a way of communicating with their communities. So those just, and they were done in English and isiXhosa. So there's another one. And they each decided what they wanted to say. They sort of had common threads, but then they also had specific things that they wanted to say about how it affected their lives and their children's literacy development. Okay, that one's inside the library. You can see. Okay. Right, how do I go back to? There we go. Okay. And then we also, with the help of, this is one of the senior journalism TV students that helped us. Was yours Lush or Tandi? Lush. Okay, I'm going to show Tandi's one. Not your, but there were 3 made by 4th year TV journalism students, and I'm going to try and show you one of them. How much time have I got now? It's not very long.
Education background yayingekho right, because thina besingenazo resources kwisikolo thina sasifunda kuzo. So that is why ndifuna i-future yomntana am at least ibe better kunaleya yam. Amalam ndinguThandi, ndiphangela eRhodes University eDrama Department, ndi-cleaner phaya. Before uwela bekanti kule ndiyamnceda for Insomi project, bezikhona i-resources esikolweni sabo, but nam ndazama ukuba ndibe yi-part and parcel ye-education yakhe, so that nam ndikwazi ukuncedisa more and more. Uwela bene-problem bengakwazi urida amanye amagama bengakwazi uwarida. Now since ejoinele i-Insomi project, at least now uyakwazi uwarida amagama kakuhle.
The king,
The mice, and the cheese.
Soon all of the mice
We're gone from palace.
were gone from palace. Three last one, the dog
Of them.
out of
Out of
the
the palace.
white dogs
And spotted dogs.
and spotted dogs.
He liked cheese best of all.
He liked cheese best of all.
Ezinye parents zinawo umdla ukuba abantwana babo mababe kwi-Insomi project. Buba la project ibiseyi-pilot, then at least ngoku sizama uba mayibe ye-community, ingabi yeyase-Rhodes only. Lapha etanki thina sinayo i-library. Then kubakho i-mobile library ekhoyo. At least once enyangeni uzawuzama uba mayibe khona le library, abantwana bethu babekwazi uba ne-access. Kuthaza into yokuba ngabana abantwana mabafundiswe ngabazali ukuze nathi sikwazi ukufundisana kunye nabantwana.
Ndivuya ukwazi le nto uThandi asichazela yona, because thina besingayazi, kuba kaloku kwindawo esihlala kuyo thina ii-library zinqabile. So siviswa into yobana kanti kukhona indawo sinokuthi abantwana
Singavuya kakhulu thina singabazali basetanki ukubana ngaba lo mbono niwenza nothi niwenze ngempumelelo.
Zikhona i-community libraries, then abazali banakho ukuncedisana nabantwana babo baye kwi-community libraries.
What by Jeanette and Cherry, his tea.
Just
He laid down on the ground.
Abantwana xa ubadibanisa bacombine endaweni, then omnye ufumanisa uba omnye yena uyakwazi udevelop iskill komnye nomnye afundisane nomnye. So that's why ndithanda uba abantwana bahleli nje bandawoni.
There are 3 little pigs. A man carrying a heavier, but along came a big bad wolf. I huffed and I puffed, and I blow your house down, yelled the wolf, and he tired. Found them safe. Little pig, I'm coming down your chimney. The end.
Well, andifuna afunde, but I cannot choose uba makafundele uba for uba yintoni. But iminqweno yam ndifuna afunde, aphumelele, so that azonceda i-community. Abantwana ke abafuna i-access for ufunda, well akwazi ubancedisa. Ingabi yinto yakhe yedwa.
Bye-bye, miss.
Oh, okay, so that's still playing. Okay, thank you. Okay, so really what we're doing here is we're supporting people at grassroots level to tell their stories in order to bring change to their community, to make other people aware of the issues around children's literacy development, to get parents more involved rather than just leaving it to schools. And it's enabling them to create spaces where they can attract people in their community to books. You heard her talk about getting the mobile library going, getting people access to libraries. And it's us supporting them to communicate inside their communicative ecologies in ways that make sense to people like themselves and to communities like themselves. And once we start writing about this process, we start creating the vertical capital about what is valuable at grassroots level. So in conclusion, working from the inside out, the 6 or 7 will become 26, will become 200 from the Insomi groups, will become hundreds. And with the right journalism, vertical capital can be created that could affect eventually policies and funding. And just to say one more example of the group communicating in an area in a way that makes sense for them is that they took it to a local preschool and addressed the parents there about what they'd been experiencing and what their findings were around their home literacy practices and their children's literacy development as an example of that face-to-face interaction, and then them linking it back to the Insomi Parents Facebook page and encouraging people to become, to come and get involved in that. And with multimedia students, we're continuing to build that communication in those platforms along with these other forms of communication. They are finding that people say, okay, well, this sounds great, so we also want to be part of Insomi. And that's why not everybody that they communicate with can, because they're not obviously all Rhodes workers, but that's why they're now starting to find ways of saying to people, you may not be at Rhodes, be able to be part of an Insomi project, but you can join your local library, or you can help us motivate for the mobile library to come to your area, or you can go to the Georgia Youth Hub and download resources for your children from the labs there. So they're busy finding other ways of saying to people, you don't have to be at Rhodes and be part of Insomi to support. Thank you very much.
So now is question and comment time. We'll be glad the presenters can see so that we can ask our questions and our comments. So please.
Thank you very much. My name is Ntogozo, and I have a question for, I forgot her name. I would say Usain Bolt, because she was really fast. Okay, firstly, thank you for such an interesting presentation. I have worked for the International Organization for Migration, which is an intergovernmental organization. Right now, a UN agency, part of the UN agencies. And I was within the Media and Communications Department. And generally as an organization, in addition to us receiving funding from all these government partners, such as USAID, PEPFAR, different government missions as well, to run our own programs, we would also apply for other NGOs or NPOs, apply funding for them, and use them as implementing partners because of a lack of capacity on certain issues. Let me not say lack of capacity, but resources to go and run the programs ourselves. Would rather get an NGO to run those programs for us. So I'd be obviously involved in the whole process of signing contracts and all of that. And there would always be disclaimers on how these NGOs or NPOs will communicate about us as the middlemen or the main funders for their programs. And usually we would need to scan through what they send out to the media, what do they say, and we would always want to comment, because us as an organization as well, we're using that opportunity to position ourselves, to position our brand. And I thought, my observation is that how do then NPOs or NGOs, how will they retain that communicative power to position themselves as organizations that can do stuff on their own? Or yes, they need the funding, but they are a brand that sells valuable services. They have the capacity, taking into consideration that there's big organizations that are giving them money, but they have that communicative power over them. They have to control how they communicate. Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning, and thank you for that question. I think one of the biggest challenges that any NPO, or let me not generalize, a lot of, or many NPOs are facing is the fact that they do not often have a communication specialist employed, which makes it extremely difficult for them to harness their communicative power. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges. And that is sometimes often due to the fact that they don't always have the funding, they don't always have the infrastructure, there's not always the skill set. And it's sad, it's really sad to do that. And I think that's why it's so important for those kind of NGOs and or NPOs, if we can broaden the field, to really empower them so that they, at the end, have the skill set to, as you say, establish their own brands, make the difference that they are obviously committed to making, and harnessing that communicative power that they do have, but in a lot of instances, they don't always have the skills to understand in what way they can contribute and make the difference that they really do. I think sometimes they find themselves in situations where they are so fixed and focused on getting the job done, and that is something that came out of a lot of interviews that I've conducted with a lot of NPO individuals. Sometimes they are so fixed on getting the job done that they forget about what the communicative power is in getting the job done, and that they can actually harness that as an aspect that they can use to promote themselves and build also their own brands and their own credibility. Because as soon as they start getting that done and they use that, I don't want to really say to their advantage, but as a matter of fact, they have to think about themselves as businesses, although they're not focused on making money. But the fact of the matter is they have to make money in order to survive. That's just the bottom line. So I think, if we are able to equip them with the skills to build that brand as well as make a difference and be proud of that, I think that's something that's very important for them. But a lot don't necessarily have the skill sets or the infrastructure available for them to get that done. I don't know if I addressed your question.
You did. I don't know, follow-up? It's not actually a follow-up, but I think it's important what you just said right now, because what I've often seen is that because they focus on doing the job at the moment, not building their brands, after the funding is cut, then the organization closes, because all this time they did not build a solid brand where they can apply for funding elsewhere and be a recognizable brand and a leader in that particular field.
I think sometimes there's a perception that a non-profit organization isn't supposed to have a brand. And I beg to differ. I think it's very important for them to have a brand, a really established position in the communities they serve, because our South African community and our South African society is very much dependent on the activities and responsibilities of what NPOs are doing and the difference they are making in the communities they serve. South Africans need them, and we need them to understand who they are and how they contribute to build and really establish this country and to take this country from point A to point B. And I think it's okay for them to have a brand, because that's the one aspect that markets them. And as you say, when that project is done, they must still be able to establish themselves and have enough credibility to move on to the next, even though there isn't funding. And that's the one aspect where the relationships and the brand play a very important role to keep them sustainable and to help them to progress and go forward. Thank you.
Thanks. It's a question for Vanessa. You're talking about the sort of role of media in accountability in the sort of education system in the Eastern Cape. And again, I'm just sort of we're thinking almost of regional media. I mean, some of the examples you showed were the Dispatch and so on. I was just wondering if you thought there was a role for local media, a little bit along the lines of what Kathy was sort of talking about, the more sort of grassroots approach. And I wonder if you would agree that the question of the democratization of schools themselves isn't an important equation in this. You were wondering whether people would want to get involved, but it's almost they're being cajoled to get involved through sort of mass media. But if you turn that on its head And if the question was the democratization of schools, you know, there's some schools where hundreds of parents rock up to SGB meetings and they get full reports and there are newsletters that go out every week, and there's a communicative ecology going on at the school level, and then it's easy for media, in a sense, to then report on that ecology and to take, you know, sort of ratchet that up to the regional level. But if democratization, you know, amongst parents, learners, teachers, the government, NGOs, etc., is not really happening at the school level, then can we ever really hope for an accountability system, you know, in terms of media, I suppose?
I think you're right. I think certainly local media, community media have a role to play in terms of, you know, as you say, reporting on what's happening, you know, at a very kind of local level. And how does that, you know, how can people in those communities get involved and hold principles, for example, to account? But part of what our understanding of what social accountability is that, you know, problems that happen at school level are part of a bigger systemic problem that comes from, you know, national level. And I think if you don't include the national kind of really big, even the, you know, public broadcasters, the big independent newspapers, if they are not, I just think if they're not thinking differently about the type of journalism that they're doing in terms of how they hold public officials to account, I don't think you'll have as great an effect in terms of the systemic issues that are causing those very individual crises. So I think you're right. I hadn't thought about the more kind of role of local and community media, but I think it has to go. I think it has to be at all levels. You know.
Hi, thank you. I just want to make a quick comment and a question, and I think that my question is pretty much related to what you were saying. But a comment that I wanted to make is that I find that oftentimes in the media space, this is directed to you, Vanessa. We talked about government underspending, but what I find lacking in the reporting is why this is happening. And also you said it in a bypassing manner that there was no explanation of why that was happening. Because I remember when I was working for the government, not here in Lesotho, I found that one of the problems why we were usually underspending was that there was always what I call an accounting irregularity, where money is there, it's allocated theoretically, but then there are pending bureaucratic procedures that sort of delay money to actually be there to be spent. So there is money for that term allocated theoretically, but the first month goes by, the second month, and only in the third month then money is there to be spent, and all the activities that ought to have been done have been pending, or some of them had to be cancelled. So what I find lacking is, why is it that, I'm not saying that is what is happening in the Eastern Cape or other provinces which are having the same problem, but why is this happening? Because I find that we see this in the media, we hear the noise, municipalities are underspending, departments are underspending, but what I find there's a void in why this is happening. The second question that I wanted to ask is, like you were saying, I find that, and this is my personal observation, but also other writers have also reiterated the same point, that the problem is not only that there is a lack of capacity or that there is a lack of resources, but also the lack of responsiveness on the part of political leaders. This is why we have protests all the time, but nothing ever really happens, nothing substantial ever happens. So what is it that we can do structurally speaking? Because it's not enough for people to know their rights, because I think in some cases people actually do know their rights. That is why there's protests all the time, because they know what they are entitled to. They know their rights. But what is it that we can do structurally speaking to try and sort of disrupt political power that is so absolute? I find that political actors amass themselves with so much support and so much, they cushion themselves to a point that even when they are being irresponsive, there's nothing that can happen to them because they have so much support from their structures. And people are unable to sort of tap in the same power to dismantle that, or to rid themselves, the politicians of that power, if they are not being responsive. So what is it that we can do structurally speaking? Thank you.
That's a for everybody. Let's all think about that. I suppose my question is, yes, how do we change the structures? How do we understand the system of public resource management? How do we understand oversight in terms of accountability as well? Who should be playing those oversight roles, within the different structures? But then it comes back to my question, which is, what is the role of the media in terms of not only disrupting the structures, but also helping citizens to understand the structures and their power in terms of changing the structures and disrupting, as you said.
Okay, so I just related to that. I mean, I think sometimes what Vanessa just said, that sometimes that is the answer. Sometimes it's actually just to break the system. And in the previous session that we had in this hall, we spoke about almost every history will show you that almost every time a victory in social justice sphere has been won, it's been because of the collective action and mobilization of many, many thousands of people. So I think collective action is the key. If, as you say, lots of people know their rights, then technically that shouldn't be too difficult to accomplish. But I think this panel has been great. I just want to say to all of you, it's fantastic, because I think that we need more and more research. Like this is the real getting your hands dirty kind of research. And everyone is waiting to go to lunch, so no one's terribly excited, but it is very exciting to me. So all of you, Lida, I'm about to start an NPO, I need your help. And Kathy, I don't know what to say to you because you're far smarter than me on everything that you talked about. I'm going to talk to Vanessa's work because Vanessa and I both work in the space of media and journalism. And before I do that, I just want to say that anyone who's interested in media and journalism studies in South Africa at the moment, this is the theorist and the researcher that you must be reading, because Vanessa is publishing some incredible stuff at the moment. She's got a book chapter in the book that was launched outside over the tea break. She just published an article in Communicatia with Anthea Garman. She's publishing 2 book chapters with me in a book that I will be releasing next year with Peter, with who's it? Eric Lowe, on media diversity and various other articles. She's doing really amazing work in that space. No, she really is. And no, they must know who they're listening to, Vanessa. Really, they must know. But I just wanted to take you on one thing, my dear. I'm going to disagree with you on one thing. Is this question of journalistic balance. Now, you addressed how, and I think we must correct this with journalists, because they seem to feel that if they have published a story about, let's say, education in the Eastern Cape, and they have interviewed someone over there, and they've got the official statement over there, then the story is balanced. And remember that this is an ethical question as well. It's in the press code, and it's in all of our courses that we teach about media ethics, is that news has to be fair, balanced, accurate, and so on. But we know it's not balanced, and I'll tell you why we know it's not balanced, because Herman Wasserman, Tanya Bosch, you and me, Stephen Friedman, Jane Duncan, and various others have done various content analysis studies in recent years on the media sources that, and I mean Elva Rodney Gumede on the Marikana story, and what we're finding over and over and over again in various different independently conducted studies is that media journalists in this country have got a very, very poor historical track record of actually speaking to the people on the ground who are most affected by the content of the report and the story. So you can't tell me your story is balanced if the people who are being affected most acutely by the content of that story, you haven't talked to them. And so I think we need to sort of redefine what we mean by a balanced journalistic story. You can tell me your story is balanced when you have quoted the local MEC, when you've quoted the local SAPS police commissioner, for example, and then when you have quoted 3 people who actually also live in the community and gotten their perspective on what's happening. That, to me, is a balanced story. And I think that we need to start also training our journalists to understand that that is also the definition of balance.
I totally agree with you. Consistently in this study, but also in other work that a content analysis that I've done, the actors in the story, so who is being written about in education, for example, is very often pupils, the learners. The story is about them. But the sources hardly ever are actual learners in the schools. It's the government official, it's the principal, it's the unionist. That's consistent. And I absolutely agree with you. I think this perception of what balance is, I mean, we've stopped speaking about journalism as objective because we know that that's a fallacy. But, you know, this idea now that it's balanced journalism, if you have the two opposite, you know, sides of the spectrum and you're just providing information, that I agree with.
Thank you. I'm going to use my bottle power. I'm going to go into school. So you can see her after. And it's been a great panel. And I really enjoyed myself. I hope everybody did. And thanks to the presenter. Thanks to everybody for making it a great time. So see you some other time.
Yourself, sir.